How does a city's most feared thug become its spiritual pioneer? Today, we're diving into the incredible, true story of Lee Ki-pung, a man whose life was a dramatic battle between violence and faith, and how his personal transformation literally changed the course of history for an entire island.
So this story comes to us from Pastor James Hong. He is a dedicated researcher of Korean mission history who actually served as a missionary in China and now has a ministry in Maryland in the USA. We're going to be sharing from his book, Remember and Repay, 52 Weeks of Mission Meditation every week. And this story right here, this is the one for the first week of February. All right, let's set the scene. The date is February 3rd, 1908. A mission is officially starting on the remote Korean island of Jeju. The man leading the charge? Pastor Lee Ki-pung, a name that would go down in history. But, the legend of the pastor is really built on the ashes of the man he used to be. Yeah, because before he was Pastor Lee, he went by let's just say, a very different title in his hometown of Pyongyang. He was the city's most notorious thug. The life of Lee Ki-pung is just a story of complete opposites. It's like two totally different men living in the same body. One was a feared brawler, and the other a man of incredible faith. To really understand how this transformation happened, we first need to get a clear picture of just how deep his violent youth really went. This guy was a total paradox. On one hand, he was a child prodigy. He had memorized these ancient, complex texts by the time he was 6. But he was also what they called a 술gore, basically a really heavy drinker, and he was famous for being an unbeatable headbutter. But what he was really known for, what made people fear him, was his terrifying skill with a stone. He was the leader in the Sikjeon, and you gotta picture this. These were massive, organized stone fights that would break out across the Dadong River. In Pyongyang, you did not want to mess with this guy. So at this time, Pyongyang is starting to open up to the West, and a new kind of foreigner is showing up: Christian missionaries. It's in this changing city that Lee Ki-pung's world of violence is about to crash head-on with the peaceful mission of a man named Samuel Moffett. And this one encounter, well, it would set off a chain reaction that nobody could have seen coming. So, seeing Moffett, Lee Ki-pung just did what he was best at. He picked up a stone, took aim, and threw it with pinpoint accuracy. It hit Moffett right in the jaw, sending him straight to the ground, bleeding. For the thug of Pyongyang, this was just another day at the office. But for the story of his life, this was absolute rock bottom. An act of violence like that, it leaves a mark, and not just on Moffett's face, but on Lee Ki-pung's conscience. So after the chaos of the Sino-Japanese War, he comes back to Pyongyang, and he is just haunted by what he did. He knows he has to face the man he wronged. He actually finds Samuel Moffett and makes this unbelievable confession. He says, straight up, "I am the thug who threw the stone that scarred your chin." Can you even imagine the courage that must have taken to stand in front of your victim and just own it completely? And this wasn't just an apology. It was a complete and total surrender. Weighed down by all this guilt, Lee Ki-pung just breaks down, weeping, and begs for forgiveness he absolutely does not feel he deserves. It was right there, in that moment of vulnerability, that the old thug died and a new man chose to be born. And believe me, he didn't waste a single moment. His transformation wasn't just some emotional feeling that faded away. It was immediate, and it was real. The former brawler started building a life centered on service and faith, like right away. You can just watch his new life take shape, step by step. By 1901, he's traveling as a colporteur, which means he's distributing Bibles. A year later, he's a josa, or a helper to another missionary. But here's the most incredible move. In 1903, he enrolls in the Pyongyang Theological Seminary, a school founded by Samuel Moffett, the very man he attacked. By 1907, the journey is complete. He's ordained as a pastor. So you have to be wondering, how in the world does a man with such a violent past even get into a seminary? Well, the answer lies in the incredible grace of his former victims. Samuel Moffett and the other missionary, Swallen, didn't just forgive him. They became his champions. They opened the doors to a future he never could have possibly imagined. Now, all of this intense personal change is happening during a massive spiritual awakening that was sweeping across Korea, known as the Pyongyang Great Revival of 1907. The entire city was just electric with change and faith. And it's in this exact atmosphere that Lee Ki-pung's new life is about to take on a truly historic meaning. on September 17, 1907. He stood with 6 other men. This number 7 is so significant because they were ordained together, becoming the first 7 pastors in the history of the Korean Presbyterian Church. What a moment. And there, right at the center of it all, stands a former gangster. But for Lee Ki-pong, getting ordained wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. He was immediately given a unique title, Korea's first missionary. Now, this wasn't a foreign appointment. For the very first time, the Korean church itself was sending one of its own to a new field. And what was that new, challenging field? Jeju Island? The man who once ruled the riverbanks of Pyongyang with a stone in his hand was now being sent to a remote island with a Bible. The transformation was finally and completely finished. You know, the story of Lee Ki-pong is so much more than just a tale of one man's redemption. It's a powerful example of what can happen when deep remorse is met with radical forgiveness. It really leaves us with a profound question to think about. What is the true potential for transformation that lies within a single life? You know, sometimes the biggest stories start in the smallest places. This is one of those. It's about how a single seed of faith, carried all the way across an ocean, found a home in a little Korean riverside town and grew into something truly historic. Let's trace that incredible journey together. Our guide for this story is Pastor James Huang. Now, Pastor Huang served as a missionary to China, and today he's ministering in Maryland, but he's also a passionate researcher of Korean mission history. We're going to be sharing stories from his incredible book, Remember and Repay, 52-Week Mission Meditation, each week. And this right here, this is the mission history story for the second week of February. All right, so our story kicks off not in some grand, ornate cathedral, but in a simple, humble home, where a really historic church was just about to be born. Okay, so picture this. The date is Sunday, February 9th, 1896. We're in a small riverside town called Gangyang, inside the home of a local man, Mr. Ji Byung-suk. And gathered there are missionary Pauling, his wife, and another missionary, Gadarin. They're just holding a simple Sunday service. But that service, that was the moment the very first Baptist church in all of Korean history was founded. Just like that. That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, Gangyang wasn't a major capital city or anything. So why there, and why these specific people? Well, the answer involves a journey that started thousands of miles away and a whole series of, you could say, fateful connections. To really get how this all happened, we've got to trace the incredible journey of the man who led that very first service, Missionary Pauling. So Pauling's path to that day was just a whirlwind. He first lands in Korea in May of 1894. He pops back to Japan for a bit, then marries Marvel Hall in Yokohama on Valentine's Day of all days in 1895. But here's the real turning point. That spring, he comes back to Korea. He meets a cloth merchant named Ji Byung-suk. Pauling shares his faith and eventually baptizes him. And believe it or not, less than a year later, they're holding that very first church service, right there in Ji's home. Okay, so we've connected the dots on how Pauling met the man who'd host the first church. But what was it that lit a fire in him to travel halfway across the world to Korea at all? For that answer, we need to bring another key player into our story. Turns out the inspiration for Pauling's mission wasn't even his own idea. Not at first. It was actually sparked by the incredible passion of another pioneer, a Canadian independent missionary. Let me introduce you to Malcolm Fenwick. This guy was the real deal. He arrived in Korea way back in 1889, and he didn't just visit. He dove right in, immersing himself in the culture, wrestling with the language, and just patiently laying the groundwork for a mission he couldn't even fully see yet. But Fenwick knew, he just knew, he couldn't do it all by himself. After 4 years in Korea, he realized he needed 2 big things: to be officially ordained as a pastor, and, just as important, he needed money and more people to join the cause. So in 1893, he gets on a boat and sails back to the United States with a very clear mission in mind. And this is where the story just blows up in the best way possible. Fenwick's trip to Boston wasn't just about fundraising. It set off this unbelievable chain reaction that turned one man's vision into a full-blown international effort. See, Fenwick had one person he absolutely had to meet, Pastor A.J. Gordon. Gordon was a huge deal in Boston. He was the pastor of the very influential Clarendon Street Baptist Church. He founded a missionary training school, and get this, he even composed the famous hymn, My Jesus, I Love Thee. Fenwick had been totally inspired by him at a conference years before, so Gordon was the guy to see. So Fenwick actually enrolls in Gordon's training school, and he quickly becomes the #1 advocate for Korea. He's telling stories, he's talking about the people, the culture, the need, and his passion, wow, it was absolutely infectious. He completely captivated Pastor Gordon and the other students, including, you guessed it, a young man named Pauling. And just like that, you see this perfect domino effect. It's an amazing chain of support. First, Fenwick's stories light a fire under Pastor Gordon. Second, Gordon's school gives guys like Pauling the training they need. Third, a special fund gets created to provide the money. And fourth, that fund sends out its very first missionaries, Pauline and Gadarin, straight to Korea. On the story behind that funding, it's incredibly moving. It was called the Ella Thing Memorial Mission. A deacon at Gordon's church had lost his only daughter, Ella, when she was very young. So he took her entire inheritance and donated it to create this mission fund. Her legacy, her family's unbelievable sacrifice, that's what paid for Pauling's journey across the ocean. So fueled by this amazing story of connection and sacrifice, the mission grew. And by 1897, the congregation was big enough to build its own dedicated church. But the way that church was designed, well, that holds a really unique story of its own, and it's one that's often misunderstood. Okay, so here's the thing. You might hear people say that the Gungyang Church was the third Protestant church building ever built in Korea, but that's not quite right. The actual fact is that it was the third Gyeokja, or G-shaped church building in Korea, and that little distinction, it's a really important historical and cultural detail. So what in the world is a Gyeok-shaped church? Well, the shape comes from the Korean letter Gyeok, which looks just like an L, and this was a totally brilliant architectural solution to a cultural challenge. Back in late 19th century Korea, social customs were very strict about separating men and women in public. The L-shaped building let the pastors stand at the corner and see both the men on one side and the women on the other, all without them having to break that important tradition. Pretty smart, right? So when you look at it in its proper architectural context, it all makes sense. You see, the Dongdaemun Church was built in this style in 1892. Then came the Sorye Church in 1895. And that makes the Gongyang Baptist Church, built in 1897, the third church to use this really unique, culturally sensitive design. So the crucial point is this. The legacy of this church isn't just about being first or third or whatever number on a list. It's about a much bigger story of international partnership, of profound personal sacrifice, and of a really thoughtful engagement with local culture that was literally built into the walls of the church itself. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? You know, from Fenwick inspiring Gordon in a classroom to Pauling meeting Ji Byung-sok on a riverbank. How many of history's really great achievements begin with just a single quiet connection between two people? You know how sometimes you walk past an old building and just know it has stories to tell? Well, today we're digging into the history of one of Seoul's most important churches, and its name, a name that tells a story of conflict, coming together, and, in the end, victory. So, the amazing story we're getting into today comes from the work of Pastor James Hwang. He's a researcher of Korean mission history who actually served as a missionary in China and now has a ministry in Maryland. We're planning to share a story each week from his book, Remember and Repay, and this right here is the mission history story for the third week of February. All right, let's dive right in. Our story doesn't start in some dusty old archive. Nope. It starts right in the middle of modern, bustling Seoul. So picture this. You're walking through the world-famous Insadong Antiques District, right, with all the energy and crowds. And right there, you can find Sungdong Church. And this isn't just any old church. It is a serious historical landmark. It was only the second Presbyterian church ever founded in Seoul, and it's known as the Mother Church for all the Presbyterian congregations in the area. It all got started thanks to an American missionary by the name of Samuel Moore. But that brings us to the real mystery, the heart of our story today. Its name, Xingdong, is written with a Chinese character that literally means victory. A church called Victory Neighborhood. Kinda unusual, right? Well, how it got that name? That's where things get really interesting. So to figure this out, we've got to rewind the clock. We need to go all the way back to the beginning, to the church's founder and its incredibly humble start. So back in 1892, Samuel Moore shows up in Korea. And that first winter, he didn't build some grand cathedral, not at all. He started a tiny school for just 6 orphans in a neighborhood they called Gwandong-gol. By the very next year, that little school had grown and officially became a church. Now, this new church wasn't just about teaching scripture. It was about to introduce an idea so radical, it would shake the very foundations of the society around it. To really get what happens next, you have to understand the social ladder in Joseon-era Korea. And I mean, it was rigid. At the absolute bottom of society were the Baekjeong. They were considered an untouchable caste, usually working as butchers, and they were completely shut out from the rest of society. So can you even imagine the shockwaves when this small church did something that was just unheard of? They elected a man named Park Sung-chun, a Baekjeong, to be one of their church leaders, an elder. In a society that was all about strict hierarchy, this was absolutely revolutionary. Yeah, and as you can probably guess, this radical decision, well, it did not go over well with everyone. In fact, it almost tore the entire young church community apart. I mean, you had 2 totally opposing worldviews just smashing into each other. On one side, you had the Yangban, the aristocracy, and they were deeply, deeply offended. For them, putting an untouchable in a leadership role was just a complete violation of how the world was supposed to work. But Samuel Moore, he wouldn't back down. He stood firm on that core belief that everyone is equal in God's eyes. And they just couldn't make it work. The conflict was too great. The Yangon members literally walked out in protest and started their own separate church. The community was completely fractured, just split right in two by this clash of culture and faith. But then, right in the middle of all this division, disaster strikes. A fire breaks out, and the original church building, the very symbol of their community, burns completely to the ground. A total loss. And here is the incredible part of the story. This shared tragedy, this moment of loss, it actually became the thing that brought them back together. Staring at the ashes of their church, the 2 divided groups found common ground and reconciled, healing that massive rift between them. Okay, so the church is back together, which brings us back to our big question. How in the world does all of this connect to the name Victory Neighborhood? Well, the church actually had a few different names over the years. It started as Gwandong-gol Church, then became Central Church. For a little while, it was even called Seungdong, but with a character that meant to inherit. But it's that final name change that tells us everything we need to know. Okay, so here is the key piece of the puzzle you've been waiting for. The church was built in a neighborhood that already had the name Seungdong. But, and this is a big but, it was written with a totally different character, one that meant monk, because there was a big Buddhist temple nearby. So the area was known as the monks' neighborhood. Now, let's jump forward to 1907. There's this massive spiritual awakening happening all across Korea known as the Pyeongpang Great Revival. It was a really fervent time. And during this revival, a very famous leader of the movement, Pastor Gil Seon-ju, gets invited to preach at the now reunited church. And during his sermon, he's looking out at that Buddhist temple down in the valley, and he issues this powerful challenge. He declares, "We must win the spiritual battle against the Temple Valley." And that was it. That sermon changed everything. The congregation was so inspired that they made a very deliberate choice. They kept the sound, Seungdong, but they changed the character. They transformed their identity from the monks' neighborhood to the Victory Neighborhood. What a powerful declaration of their faith and their mission. The story of Seungdong Church is just incredible proof that a simple name can carry a whole history of social revolution, of painful division, and beautiful reunion. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other profound stories are hidden in the names of the streets and places we walk by every single day?
So let's get right into this incredible piece of history. This story comes to us from the work of Pastor James Huang. Now, he served as a missionary in China and is now ministering in Maryland, but he's also a real student of Korean mission history. He wrote a book called Remember and Repay, 52 Weeks of Mission Meditation, and we're diving into this story for the 4th week of February. It uncovers a connection you might have never known existed.
Okay, so Billy Graham. I mean, the man was a household name, right? A global evangelist who spoke to millions upon millions of people. But here's the thing. Of all the countries in the world, he had this really deep, special affection for Korea. And the big question is, why? What was the story behind that unique bond? Well, that is exactly what we are going to unpack.
So first, before we can really get the why, we need to understand the who. We have to appreciate the sheer scale of his influence. So let's talk about Billy Graham, the global evangelist. I mean, just look at that lifespan. His life stretched across an entire century of massive change. He was born in 1918, passed away in 2018 at 99 years old. And while he was born on a small farm, his life's path took him somewhere else entirely. At Wheaton College, he met the woman who would change everything for him, Ruth Bell. They got married in 1943, and that began a partnership that would, quite literally, change the world.
So what was his secret? What was the key to his preaching? It was actually incredibly simple. When researchers went back and analyzed his sermons, the phrase he used more than any other by a long shot was, "The Bible says." For Graham, that was it. The Bible was the absolute, final authority. And his message was crystal clear. Salvation comes only through Jesus Christ. This simple, unwavering belief was the engine behind his entire global ministry.
So, what was the real power source behind a ministry that spanned decades and crossed the entire globe? Well, Billy Graham himself confessed that the true driving force, his ultimate partner in everything, was his wife, Ruth Bell. He didn't just see her as his spouse. He always, and I mean always, referred to her as a core member of our team. And, that wasn't just some cute nickname. It was a fact. Ruth Bell Graham was an absolutely essential partner in his mission. And as we're about to find out, she is the key to answering our big question about Korea.
And this brings us to Ruth Bell's incredible background. Her personal history isn't just some side note in this story. No, it is the very reason for Billy Graham's deep and lifelong connection to Korea.
And here it is. This is the connection. Ruth was the daughter of an American medical missionary born near Shanghai, China. But here's the clincher. Because there weren't really any suitable schools for foreign kids in China at the time, she was sent to a high school for missionary children in Pyongyang. That's right. She knew Korea firsthand. She lived there.
Now, having grown up in China, Ruth had a real love for Chinese characters. And this one was her absolute favorite. It's the character Ji, which means righteousness. But look how it's formed. You have the character for lamb on top of the character for I, or me. For her, this was the entire gospel in a single image. The Lamb of God, Jesus, covering me to make me righteous. This was so central to her faith that this very character is inscribed on her tombstone.
So, when you understand this deep personal history through his wife, it all just clicks into place, doesn't it? It suddenly makes perfect sense why Billy Graham had such a special affection for Korea. For him, it wasn't just another country on a map. It was woven into his own family's story.
And that affection was returned in a way that it's hard to even comprehend. At his historic crusade in 1973, held in Seoul's Yeouido Plaza, an estimated 1.1 million people gathered for a single event to hear him preach. That is a truly staggering number, and it's still one of the largest religious gatherings in all of history.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing. His commitment to the Korean people went on for decades, and it even transcended politics. He was there holding rallies for troops in 1952, right in the middle of the Korean War. He came back for that massive crusade in 73, and again in 84 for the mission's 100th anniversary. And get this, he even visited North Korea, twice, in the 90s, at the personal invitation of Kim Il-sung himself. It just shows his connection was to the entire peninsula.
So ultimately, this really isn't just his story. And it isn't just her story, it's their story. It's a shared legacy of faith that somehow powerfully connects a small farm in North Carolina to a missionary school in Pyongyang, with a message that would echo across the entire globe.
And in the end, their lifelong partnership was sealed for eternity. After nearly a century of life, Billy Graham was laid to rest right beside Ruth, the woman he called his team, and the hidden force who first connected his heart to the people of Korea.
And that really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? We so often focus on the famous figures we see on the world stage. But this story reminds us to ask, how can one person's hidden story, their personal history, quietly and profoundly move the entire course of global events?